Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Daria. It's such a pleasure for me to spend some time with you this morning, and I definitely want to second what both Daria and Kate said. Thank you for coming here, for those of you in the room. Thank you for joining us online, for those of you who are participating this way. This is a really important event for us. It is so great to be here with all of you. Because right now, when you wake up in the morning, let's be honest, it's a pretty tumultuous time. You know, I just think that when you look at history, there are some years that witness relatively little change, and yet there are some months where you see years worth of change in what feels like a few weeks. And I think in many ways, the first 3 months of 2025 have brought enormous change, and not all of it is easy for nonprofits, especially when you look at sources of funding. And so we realize what an important time this is. What I want to do this morning is talk about where technology fits in. Because after all, as you can imagine, this is really a conference about what technology can do for nonprofits. And so where I think I fit into the time that we have together is to share some perspective about technology and especially AI. What does it mean for nonprofits? But even more than that, how are we thinking about it at Microsoft? And let me start by putting it in the context of what economists think about. As economists think about technology, there's really two types of technology: a general purpose technology and a single purpose tool. Most technologies in the world are in fact single purpose tools. A light bulb, a smoke detector, a drill. They do one thing really, really well. But a general purpose technology, what economists call a GPT, is a technology that basically impacts the entire economy. Electricity is really the archetype. And when you think about it, every aspect of our economy runs on electricity. It changed everything. And interestingly, what historians have learned is that GPTs have really been the driving force of all of the industrial revolutions. The first industrial revolution started in England in the 1700s, and it was really driven by ironworking and the steam engine, but ironworking more than anything else. The second industrial revolution really took off more in the United States than anywhere else, and it was a combination of electricity and machine tools. Machine tools really built the modern manufacturing economy. And the third industrial revolution is really the story of our lives. It started with the computer chip, and when it was combined with software, it fueled a digital era. Now, interestingly, when people think about these industrial revolutions, and I find especially when you meet with people in government, they always think first and foremost about what it means to be at the frontier of the leading edge, the leading sector, like a GPU when you're thinking about AI. Those things matter, but what history teaches us is that what matters even more is not being the inventor of the leading edge, is what economists call diffusion. It's actually the use of technology as quickly and as broadly as possible. Or what economists call diffusion, we in the tech sector call adoption. And this makes great sense when you think about it, because after all, take electricity. If it can change every part of the economy, then the countries that benefit most are those that use it in every part of the economy. And you see this in the data. For example, this is the growth in electricity consumption on a per capita basis in the United States. As electricity consumption grew, GDP per capita grew as well. I have slides like this for basically every country on the planet, and they're all the same. The correlation is extraordinary. And what was true for electricity in the second industrial revolution also became true for digitization in the third industrial revolution. And this is something that we at Microsoft understand not only because we're interested in history and we read, but in a sense, this is actually our story as a company. Microsoft was founded on April 4th, 1975. If you look at the calendar, you realize that we'll have our 50th birthday a week from Friday. Yeah. But what's interesting when I look at the history of Microsoft, and as somebody who's been here for almost 32 years, in many ways, we are a software company and always have been, a technology company and have always been, but we're really a GPT diffusion company, a general purpose technology diffusion engine. The company's very first mission was defined by a young Bill Gates and Paul Allen and Steve Ballmer. It was about a computer on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software. Now, what I find most interesting about this first mission statement is there is one word in it that's used twice, the word every. And we fast forward almost 50 years to today, and the font in our mission statement has changed, but that same word is still used twice. Now we are about empowering every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. Every is something that defines what we have always tried to do as a company, to bring technology to everyone. And in many ways, Microsoft is one of the companies that has served as the heart of, if you will, of this third industrial revolution. We'll celebrate our 50th birthday next Friday. It'll be fun, but really, it's always here about the future. Usually a year at a time, maybe 5 years at a time. But I do think we're at a moment when we can look forward more broadly and start to imagine collectively what might the second quarter of the 21st century bring. Well, one thing we believe is clear, even in a world with so much uncertainty, AI really is the next general purpose technology. You think about the problem on planet Earth, AI will serve a role in helping to solve it. It will impact every part of the economy. I do think it really is the electricity of our era. So the real question is, how do we as a company, really how do we as a community, think about what it will take to ensure that this new general purpose technology in fact serves the world well? Well, interestingly, the more we've thought about it, the more we've concluded there's actually 4 critical ingredients for success. And I want to talk about each of them briefly. Not surprisingly, it starts with the technology itself. It turns out that every GPT, every general purpose technology, is built with a technology stack, a stack of technologies that need to come together. And you can see this from electricity, really the GPT that's most familiar to most people in the world. It was 1878 when Thomas Edison first was able to use electricity to light a light bulb. And then it was 4 years later in Manhattan that for the first time there was a power plant that illuminated the lights in buildings. The very first building to light up was the New York Times building. I think that no one probably imagined in 1878, when Edison lit that first light bulb, that they were going to need to build an entire tech stack. But that's what was required. It started with the fuel to power the generators in the power plants. And then they needed to be connected with a grid that would reach every building and home that was using electricity. There needed to be transformers and circuit breakers built into the grid. There needed to be wiring and switches and circuit breakers. There needed to be appliances that actually made electricity useful. And then there were the new opportunities for manufacturers, for users. In effect, this became the tech stack for electricity, and it created a new economy because every layer of this tech stack had new businesses, new jobs, new skills that all needed to come together. But what I think is most interesting about this is the innovation that was unleashed, especially at what I would call the appliance layer. If you go to your home, when you leave this, or if you're watching online, you may be watching from home. If you look around your kitchen, if you look around your flat or apartment or house, almost everything you see will have been invented in the first 20 years after electricity took off in Lower Manhattan. Imagine what it must have felt like if it was a hot summer day and for the very first time you walked into a room that had an electric fan. Or imagine what life meant when you actually had a washing machine. Or in some ways, my favorite, imagine for the very first time walking into a kitchen that had a blender. I mean, what is this thing? It's loud, and then you would realize how much easier it made it to prepare dinner. All of these things probably felt like magic. And in a sense, they were magical in terms of the impact they had on societies that could benefit from them. Well, it's no longer 1878 or 1882. Now it's 2025. And interestingly, AI is also being built on a tech stack. The tech stack fundamentally has three layers: the infrastructure layer with the land and power and chips and data centers, the platform layer, and the counterpart to that appliance layer, the applications layer. And one of the things, really the heart of what we're doing at Microsoft from a technology perspective, is focusing on investing and innovating in all three layers. It starts with the infrastructure layer, which to me is just extraordinary. I love visiting data centers. At some level, they all look the same, and at some level, they're all different. I'm amazed by just the extraordinary amount of wiring and liquid cooling and the chips and basically the electrical engineers and electricians and the mechanical engineers and the pipe fitters. These really are, in many ways, the power plants of our time. The critical digital infrastructure on which AI relies. And we're building it around the world. We're spending $80 billion this year alone to build out this infrastructure. We're building it in more countries than any other company because you have to have the infrastructure so that AI can be put to work. But you can't stop there. It's then the platform layer that makes it possible to build applications that will put this infrastructure to work. So there's foundation models like a GPT-4 or a GPT-4o coming from a company like OpenAI, our critical partner. But we're in fact seeing many of these foundation models, some based on large investments in training, some being more focused, some being open source, but all of those are coming together. They're all trained with large amounts of data, but what really is the key at the platform layer is, in addition, a third layer, the platform level services. So what we're doing at Microsoft is thinking and working and investing and innovating in putting these three pieces together. There's all of the platform software components that we are building out, because these are the digital tools, or tool chain, as software developers now refer to it, that make it possible for people then to build applications on top that are infused with the power of AI. And so when you really look at what we're doing, and I think where we so closely connect with all of you, is the ability to support nonprofits around the world, and startups around the world, and large companies and governments around the world. It's really all of the people who will unleash innovation at the applications layer to put the power of AI to work to solve the world's problems. Now, all of this is like a giant flywheel, because in truth, it all has to get moving. You build the infrastructure so that you can train a model and deploy it around the world. You provide those models so that applications can be built on top. But you need the applications to take off, to become popular, to be used, to generate the revenue, to keep investing in the infrastructure. And like a giant flywheel, there are days when it all seems to work seamlessly and in symmetry, and most other days when there seems like there's more progress at one layer than another, and you're constantly focused, if you're at a place like Microsoft, in identifying each area. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the problems that need to be solved? 100 years from now, people will look back and say, oh, it must have been easy. Well, if you're in the heart of it, of course you appreciate that it's always hard. But that's the technology layer. Now, if the only thing we did as a technology company was master the technology, we would do a quarter of what is needed in order to build this new era of AI. So it's really combining the technology with these other things, starting with economics. Interestingly, every tech stack actually has an economic structure. And that's one of the really important things to always think about and understand. Because this is true of electricity, it's true of AI, it's been true of every general purpose technology. If you look at electricity, for example, what you see is that the power plants are enormously expensive. The power grid is enormously expensive. But the appliances, in contrast, are not. They were cheaper to invent and obviously much cheaper to manufacture or buy. Now, what is interesting is that fundamental economic structure of the second industrial revolution is in fact being repeated, because AI infrastructure is very expensive. And this is very different from, say, the third industrial revolution, when somebody like Michael Dell could really make enormous progress in taking the costs out of, call it the hardware layer, and help make personal computers within a few years cost a half or only a third of what they cost before. And then the software applications were built on top. But this era requires massive capital at the bottom in the infrastructure, even when the opportunities at the top remain much less expensive. Now, that economic structure actually translates into a financial architecture, because you can't build this tech stack without having a real vision and a strategy for the financial architecture that's needed. And you see Microsoft not only doing this in our own investments, it helps explain why you see headlines like the big capital funds coming together. For example, the one that BlackRock and Microsoft and MGX, and then more recently NVIDIA and xAI are all helping to raise, to generate even more capital, to help bring innovation to the entire supply chain of what is needed, and to help invest in all of this that needs to be built around the world. In fact, interestingly enough, I think we're seeing this financial architecture evolve before our eyes as well. It starts with the big investments by private companies. It then has this private capital. It has investments by sovereign wealth funds. And I do believe that we are likely to need other public funding as well to fill in the gaps, especially on a continent like Africa, where those gaps are real, and you reach the limits of what makes sense for private capital, the private market, to invest in. And then the last piece of this economic aspect is really the business model. It turns out that you always need stable, oftentimes innovative business models. That's what sustainable success is built upon. And when you think about digital technology, it always comes down to one of three business models. The first is a subscription. It's like subscribing to a magazine. You pay once and you can read one story a week. You can read every story in every issue if that's what you want. That is, in fact, M365 that we offer. Somebody can buy a subscription and they can use every feature. Very few people do. They can use only one application, but that is the way a subscription works. Then there's consumption. That's the way the cloud services work, including Azure. People pay for the amount they use, and in effect, they pay as they go. And then there's advertising. And advertising has really emerged, as you all know, as really being at the heart of many consumer-based digital services. People may get up and look at Instagram in the morning and they'll never pay for it, but obviously advertising is what is paying for that service to exist. To me, the most interesting thing is just to recognize business models will evolve. We don't yet know what they're going to look like a decade from now. And I think the most interesting story, if you look at the history of general purpose technologies, is how they evolved for electricity. Electricity grew first in the United States, as I mentioned, and interestingly enough, the person who was the leader of basically the company that Thomas Edison had founded was visiting the UK, visiting England, where he was born and had grown up. And at the time, in Chicago, where he lived, you could still walk down a street. This was in the 1890s. Electricity had been around for 15 years at that point. And you would see some stores and some homes that were clearly lit and others that were still running on kerosene. People were still slow to adopt it. But this gentleman spent a weekend in Brighton on the beach on the south coast of England. And when he arrived, he walked down the street and every store was lit by electricity. And he wondered, what's going on here? What have these people figured out that we have not figured out in Chicago or the United States? So he found the manager of the local power plant. And what he did was he showed him an invention. It was called a power meter. It was what was put in every store so that people were not paying on a subscription basis as they were in Chicago, but paying on a consumption basis instead. It turned out for the first 15 years of electricity in the United States, when you bought a light bulb, you bought a subscription so that you could turn it on. It turned out that once the business model evolved to consumption, it became far easier for people to go buy more light bulbs and just pay the bill at the end of the month. I love that story because I think the real lesson is not just about business models, it's about humility. Every industrial revolution is led by people who frankly not only are really smart, but they think they're really smart. And the real lesson is that nobody knows everything. We all are going to learn together as we go through this. And that is, in part, how we'll master the economics that will be needed for success. Now, the third key ingredient you might look at, and sometimes people do, and say, well, I'm surprised that this rate rises to the same level, skilling. Why is that as important as economics and technology? Well, it turns out that skilling is the fundamental force that drives the adoption and growth of each of these industrial revolutions. It makes sense, because if a new technology is going to be used across the economy, the skills to put it to work need to be mastered across the economy. So why did ironworking take off in England? It wasn't just because George Watt had invented the steam engine there. It was because England at the time had a system of technical institutes and apprenticeships that taught people in the evening how to master ironworking. And so ironworking spread more quickly. The US benefited from this amazing coincidence when it came to electricity and machine tooling. Because in 1862, during the Civil War in the United States, Abraham Lincoln had championed and then signed into law what became known as land-grant colleges. The federal government granted federal land to the states to create land-grant colleges. I'm sure some of you have degrees from them. And it was all started to really advance an understanding of agricultural science and agricultural engineering, but it led to this new discipline in the United States called mechanical engineering. And so because the United States had mechanical engineers, they were able to figure out how to put machine tools to work to change manufacturing across the economy. And then when the industry standardized, they were able to go even faster. And the same thing was true in the third industrial revolution. Interestingly, employers invested in training of employees in the 1980s, and computer science departments absolutely swept the nation in the United States. All the major colleges and universities created these computer science departments. So the US had more people who could code on a per capita basis than any other country. And people have learned over time that this need for skilling is not just deep, it is broad. One of the best illustrations of this was what the electricity industry realized in the 1950s. They had built out power plants, but electricity was not being used as widely as the industry hoped. So the industry got together and said, you know what we need to do? We need to help the American public actually just learn what a new generation of appliances can do in their homes. We need to bring this into people's homes using the power of television. We have to find somebody who can connect with the public and help them learn about this in an interesting and even enjoyable way. So they found this fellow who was working in Las Vegas at the time. He was an actor. He wasn't well known at the time, but he had this natural ability not only to communicate, but to connect. His name was Ronald Reagan. And so Ronald Reagan, with his wife Nancy, started to come to everyone's home every Sunday evening when GE would host basically a theater, a play that evening. But before it began, Ronald and Nancy would show off the latest appliance in their home. They ended up with so many appliances in their home that they needed to put in place an additional electrical generator just to power all of it. But it worked. And it probably was indispensable in the rest of his career, including becoming president of the United States. It shows how skilling needs to connect with people. I think one of our great opportunities and challenges as a company, as a community, as an industry, really as a planet, is to think about AI skilling at scale and make it one of the great opportunities and causes together for the next decade and two to come. And it really starts by understanding, thinking about what are the skills that people need to learn. And we should recognize these are early days. We don't yet know exactly what we're going to need. But we do think there are at least three categories. There's fluency, just learning how to use AI, learning how to use a Copilot or ChatGPT or in other everyday software applications. That is what we are doing. That's what we are doing in partnership with many of you. It is a little bit like what Ronald Reagan did. We just haven't hired Ronald Reagan yet. The next is AI engineering. I think this is the future of computer science. The real question is, what will a computer science degree look like a decade from now? Will it be an AI science degree? What will people need to learn in order to really create AI applications? There's a good chance it will involve less code because AI is getting very adept at coding, but an enormous amount of design and probably, I think, more multiple disciplines because people need to really master all of the impacts of AI and how to make them more useful. And then there's what we think about as AI systems design. If you're an organizational leader, how do you understand your workflows, what we would think of as your business processes? Which ones are most likely to benefit from the application of AI? How do you measure the success? How do you take people through cultural change? And in effect, every country is going to need to develop its own national AI talent strategy, assessing their economy, looking at the different sectors. Where are there real needs for skilling and what type? Where is there the ability to partner, often with nonprofits, and definitely through the education sector, to build AI fluency for everyone and build out all of the other skills that are needed? All of these things will need to come together to master skilling. And then you have the final piece. It's what historians and political and social scientists call social acceptance. It turns out that broad technology adoption requires social acceptance. It sort of makes sense when you think about it, but in the 1980s, social scientists went to work, sociologists in particular, and they asked a very important question. Why did some technologies take off and get used broadly when others did not? And it turned out that their studies showed it always came down to two factors. First, something needed to be useful. Unless it was useful, people wouldn't use it. That seems obvious, but the other is that it had to be trusted. And I think it's this element of trust that is also at the heart of what we need to advance when it comes to AI. And that's what we're doing. And as we think about trust, we see these four elements. There's security, there's privacy, there's digital safety, I'd say especially the protection of children and others, and there's this discipline called responsible AI that has emerged in the industry and has really spread around the world, including through oftentimes new laws and regulations. And just as there's a tech stack for the technology itself, there's sort of a stack that we're building for AI governance. There's an architecture. I think it starts with the internal policies at tech companies. We have now corporate standards in these places for these topics. We train engineers, we have engineering tools, we have compliance systems. And the same is true for customers, whether they're nonprofits or companies or governments. But I think on top of that, we're seeing emerge industry standards. The standards are critical because they define best practices. And as best practices emerge, there's the foundation for, say, the domestic policy, ultimately the international policies that are needed. This, too, needs to come together in order for AI to spread around the world. And because this is 2025 and not 1882, we have to add an element to this aspect for social acceptance called environmental sustainability. Because it does turn out, as everyone knows, that those big data centers that you saw the pictures of run on a large amount of electricity, which is why we're so focused and why we remain so committed to achieving in 2030 the goals we set for ourselves in 2020, to be carbon negative by the end of this decade. And what that means is reducing our emissions from electricity and from the use of greener steel and greener concrete and greener fuels and the like, and then engaging in carbon removal. It is what has made Microsoft the largest corporate investor on the planet of the removal of carbon from the environment. So that's how we achieve, we believe, social acceptance. What I think is most interesting about this is to be truly successful, you actually have to do not one of those four things. You have to do all four of them at the same time. And I do think that what perhaps differentiates us from, say, other tech companies more than anything else, it's the fact that we are working so hard to master all four of these things together. And you're going to see new initiatives, new innovations, and new investments in the coming months, in the next year, in all four of these areas. I would then conclude by just offering a thought about what the history of technology teaches us. I'd first start with the cautionary tale. It goes back to electricity. I actually believe that the diffusion of electricity was both remarkable and at the same time represents the single greatest technology tragedy in history. What is the tragedy? It's the fact that today we come together 143 years after that power plant started operating in Manhattan, and there are still 700 million people on planet Earth that tonight won't be able to use electricity to light a light bulb because they don't have access to it. It's 43% of the people who live in Africa. I think that the #1 cause of the great global divide between the global north and the global south, the economic divide that has afflicted so many now generations of people's lives, has fundamentally been based on whether they lived in a place that had access to electricity. We need to do better. Let's face it, if it takes 150 years to bring AI to the world, then we will have failed. Our goal, I think, needs to bring AI to the world, not in 150 years, but in 15. That is the opportunity that we have to think anew and act differently. And then what it asks us to do is think about how we work together. Because you're at Microsoft, I would start with the purpose of a company. Satya Nadella, our CEO, likes to quote a professor named Colin Mayer, who said, the purpose of a company is to find profitable solutions to the world's problems. I fundamentally believe that every healthy society is built on a healthy three-legged stool. There are governments that obtain money by taxing it, and they spend money to solve the world's problems. They create the fundamental social infrastructure needed for a civilized society. And then you have nonprofits that raise money to solve the world's problems. And then you have companies that sell products and services to earn a profit to solve the world's problems. And what is most interesting in the world today, in my view, is that while people often spend their time talking about how we're different, what we don't talk about is how we do our best work, not just as separate organizations, but in communities and countries when we all complement each other, because that is what we do. So in sum, we know our role well. It is to pursue profitable solutions to the world's problems, mostly by building out that infrastructure layer, building out the platform layer, so you can go to work, as can we, with applications that will make the world a better place. In essence, our role is to serve you. At Microsoft, we serve the world's nonprofits so you can serve the world. And when we do that together, even in a hard day, a hard month, or a hard year, we make the world a better place. Thank you very much.